Third world medical degree. That's what Dr. Mercer would say 3 days from now, his voice carrying the particular contempt of a man who'd never held a dying person in his hands. But Sarah Chen didn't know that yet. At 2:17 a.m., she was still invisible, the night shift nurse with the slight accent, the one who arrived on time and left without complaint, the one nobody at St. Michael's Hospital in San Antonio had bothered to really see. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above the ICU. Sarah moved between monitors with the economical grace of someone who'd learned long ago that wasted motion meant wasted time, that efficiency wasn't just professional, it was survival. Her scrubs were faded teal, standard issue, concealing the pale line of scar tissue that ran from her left shoulder to her ribs. Baghdad, 2009. Shrapnel from an IED blast that should have killed her. The limp in her left side, barely perceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, told the rest of the story in a language only other soldiers understood. She'd trained herself to be forgettable. Captain Sarah Chen, Silver Star recipient, the operator they'd called Phantom during her time with the 75th Ranger Regiment, had learned that disappearing was its own form of power. Now, at St. Michael's, she wore invisibility like armor. Her locker on the 3rd floor held exactly 3 personal items, a photograph of her 10-year-old son Danny, a change of clothes, and a small American flag, folded into the precise triangle that military families knew by heart. The flag had belonged to her teammate, Sergeant Marcus Martinez, who'd bled out in her arms in a compound outside Fallujah. She touched the flag before every shift, pressing the cool fabric against her chest for just a moment. Prayer, ritual, and promise all at once. The promise that she would keep living when others couldn't. The night shift at St. Michael's started at 10 p.m. and ran until 6 a.m. 5 other nurses rotated through, but Sarah preferred the 2 a.m. hours when the hospital breathed differently, when the chaos of day shift had settled into a rhythm of monitors beeping their constant reassurance, when most people in the building were just trying to keep breathing until sunrise. She worked the ICU, beds 12 through 24, and she knew every machine, every medication, every patient by the pattern of their vital signs. It was during her 2 a.m. chart review that the call came through the overhead speaker. Code yellow to emergency department. Incoming trauma. The words meant nothing special. St. Michael's processed trauma cases through the ER all day and night. But when the phone at the nurse's station rang 30 seconds later, Sarah's hands paused mid-keystroke. They're trying to find placement, the ER nurse said. Her name was Patricia, and Sarah had worked with her for 4 years. Patricia's voice carried the particular exhaustion that came from fighting a battle you knew you were losing. Nobody wants this one. Sarah didn't ask questions. She listened. Blind male, early 30s. Gunshot wound to the thorax, 6 weeks ago. Secondary infection in the lung tissue. He's on his 3rd sepsis workup. Dr. Harrington said no. Said we don't have ICU resources for non-paying cases. Then Dr. Patel came down and looked at the chart and said the same thing. Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Kim, they're all saying the same thing, Sarah. Nobody's taking him. 5 doctors. The number stuck in Sarah's mind like a bullet casing. 5. Sarah asked quietly. Dr. Mercer just finished his exam. That makes 5. He told the patient directly that we don't have capacity for his case. Said it with the family standing right there. Patricia paused. The background sounds of the ER, monitors beeping, voices calling, the organized chaos of emergency medicine, filled the silence. I'm looking at this guy's chart, Sarah. He's a war hero. Marine. Lost his sight in the same incident that nearly killed him. And nobody here will touch him. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly. Just a fraction of movement. The kind that only people trained in reading human behavior would notice. What's his name? Sarah asked. Sergeant Marcus Webb. 32 years old. No insurance. Veterans' benefits are tied up in some kind of administrative hold. His mother's been calling all morning, but the hospital's told her there's nothing they can do. The name moved through Sarah's mind like a key turning in a lock. Sergeant Marcus Webb. She knew that name. She'd heard it from her son's mouth exactly 847 days ago, when Danny had come home from his third deployment with his arm in a sling and his eyes carrying the weight of things he couldn't explain. Danny had talked about his commanding officer exactly once, during a night when he'd had whiskey and couldn't hold the memories down anymore. Captain Webb, Danny had said, his voice thick. He walked point for us through San Jin. He's blind now. Lost both eyes. But he sent me home alive. He made sure we all made it back. Sarah's hands moved on their own, pulling up the patient information system. Webb, Marcus, admitted to emergency department 2:04 a.m. Temperature 39.8 degrees Celsius. Blood pressure 88/54 and dropping. Oxygen saturation 91% on supplemental oxygen. The chart noted aggressive care contraindicated, consult with family regarding comfort measures. Translation: the hospital had already decided he was going to die, and they decided it should happen quickly. Sarah stood. The motion was smooth, certain, carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from making decisions in situations where hesitation meant bodies in bags. "I'll take him," she said. Sarah, the attending. The attending made his decision. "I'm making mine. Transfer him to ICU, bed 14. I'll have the room ready in 4 minutes." Sarah, Dr. Mercer specifically said. "Dr. Mercer doesn't control my patient assignments at night. Send him up." The line went quiet for a moment. Then Patricia said, very carefully, "You know this is going to be a fight." "I've had worse fights," Sarah said, and she hung up the phone. She had exactly 4 minutes. The 4 line would need to be changed. She could see from the chart that the ER had established access through a 20-gauge peripheral catheter in the right forearm, which would be insufficient if Webb required rapid infusion for sepsis. She'd need to establish a central line, probably a femoral stick given his compromised peripheral access. Blood cultures, aggressive fluid resuscitation, broad-spectrum antibiotics, the standard sepsis protocol that Dr. Harrington and the others had apparently decided Webb didn't deserve. Sarah moved through the ICU with the focused intensity of someone running a mission. Bed 14 was occupied by Mr. Hernandez, who was being transferred out at shift change. She had Patricia coordinate the move while she worked. Fresh linen. Fresh for pole. The equipment she'd need laid out on the bedside table with the precision of surgical instruments. Everything aligned, everything ready, everything exactly where her hands would know to find it. The stretcher came through the doors at 2:19 a.m. Sergeant Marcus Webb was a compact man with shoulders that suggested the muscle memory of someone who'd lived in his own strength before the world took his eyes. The bandages covering his eye sockets were stained with fluid, infection tracking through the damaged tissue. His skin carried the grey-white pallor of sepsis, the body shutting down as the infection spread through his bloodstream like an invading army. His mother followed the stretcher, her face carrying the particular devastation that came from watching your child suffer when you had no power to stop it. Sarah met them at the bed. Her face was composed, professional, the practiced expression of a nurse who'd done this thousands of times. But her eyes, for just a fraction of a second, one person in that room might have seen something else. Recognition. Memory. The weight of connection. "Sergeant Webb," Sarah said, her voice level and steady. "I'm Sarah. I'm your night nurse in the ICU. We're going to get you stable." Webb's head turned slightly toward her voice. He was training to navigate the world without sight, she realized. Listening for movement, for breathing patterns, for the subtle audio geography of human presence. He said, his voice hoarse from the fever. "They said, the doctors said." "The doctors were wrong," Sarah said. She was already moving, disconnecting the ER4 and prepping the line for the upgrade. Her hands moved with practiced precision. 22 years in medicine, but that wasn't the real story. The real story was 3 years before that, in the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical section, learning how to save lives in situations where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away and the flight might take 40 minutes. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway at 2:31 a.m. He was a tall man with expensive shoes and the kind of posture that came from believing the world had been constructed specifically to accommodate his importance. His scrubs were tailored. His hands were manicured. He carried a chart like a weapon. "Nurse Chen," he said, his tone suggesting he'd just discovered her committing a crime. "This patient was triaged as comfort care only. Why is he being admitted to ICU?" Sarah didn't stop working. The new 4-catheter, 18-gauge, much better for fluid resuscitation, slid into Webb's left arm with smooth efficiency. The tourniquet released. The needle withdrew. The 4 secured and running normal saline at kVO rate while Sarah prepared the femoral access. "Because he needs ICU care," she said without looking up. "The hospital doesn't have resources." "The hospital has me," Sarah said. Her hands were steady. Absolutely steady. The kind of steady that came from having already survived worse. "Bed 14 is available. This patient will occupy it. If you'd like to discuss it further, you can consult with the night supervisor." Dr. Mercer's face shifted. Just slightly. A flicker of something, irritation, surprise, perhaps the first awareness that this particular nurse was not going to accept his authority as the final word on who lived and who died in his hospital. He turned without speaking and left. Sarah's hands continued their work. The femoral access required more precision. She palpated the artery, found the landmark, prepared the site with betadine in the careful circle of someone who'd done this under fire. The needle went in. The guide wire followed. The catheter was secured, a central line that would allow her to deliver the medications Webb needed to survive. Webb's mother stood at the bedside, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had gone white. "Will he make it?" she asked. The question carried everything: hope, desperation, the particular fear that comes from watching someone you love die by inches. Sarah met her eyes. "I'm going to do everything I can," she said. It was both a promise and the truth, and in the particular language that passed between mothers and caregivers, it meant something else entirely. It meant she was going to treat this man like he mattered. Like his life had value. Like he deserved to fight for it. Webb's hand reached out, and his mother took it. "Who's there?" he asked. His fever had pushed his voice into a higher register, strained and tight. "The night nurse," Sarah said. "The one who's going to keep you alive." She didn't know yet that she'd known his commanding officer for 3 years. Didn't know that Danny had come home with stories about Sergeant Webb, how he'd led from the front, how he'd never asked his people to do anything he wouldn't do, how he'd walk point through Sanjin Valley knowing that every step could be his last but doing it anyway because that's what leaders did. She'd listened to her son tell those stories and filed them away, the way mothers do when their children are processing trauma through anecdote. But something in her recognition was already forming. Something in the way Webb held himself even through the fever. Something in the way he'd moved his head toward her voice, training himself to navigate a world of darkness with the same methodical precision that soldiers used to navigate war zones. The night deepened. Sarah worked methodically through the sepsis protocol. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, cefepime and vancomycin, because the infection was already showing resistance patterns on the preliminary cultures. Fluid resuscitation calculated precisely based on Webb's weight and presentation. Continuous cardiac monitoring. Blood cultures drawn and sent to the lab. A urinary catheter placed because she needed accurate fluid output measurements. Everything textbook. Everything professional. Everything exactly as it should be done for a patient that 5 doctors had decided didn't deserve care. At 4:17 a.m., during her break, Sarah stepped into the supply room and her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, secure phone. Check-in required. She'd been expecting this. The Pentagon didn't send operatives into civilian spaces without maintaining contact. She deleted the message immediately and reached for the backup phone she kept taped to the bottom of the towel dispenser. Military-grade encryption. Untraceable. She dialed. The voice on the other end was clipped, efficient, carrying the particular authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Status," it said. Target is at St. Michael's. ICU bed 14. Admitted with secondary infection but stable for now. Surveillance. Established. Eyes on. Good. His witness classified material. Enemy intelligence is attempting extraction. We need to know if anyone approaches him with offers or threats. Monitor all contacts. Report anything unusual. Understood, Sarah said. The line went dead. She taped the phone back under the dispenser and returned to her floor. Sergeant Webb's fever was holding at 39.6 degrees. His oxygen saturation had improved slightly to 93%. The antibiotics were running. The 4 fluids were flowing. He was still alive, still fighting, still holding his mother's hand in the darkness of the ICU at 4:20 a.m. on a night that neither of them knew was about to change everything. Sarah checked his vitals one more time and made a note in the chart. The notation was routine, professional, invisible to anyone reading it. But in that moment, watching the blind man rest and his mother keep vigil, Sarah Chen made a decision that would fracture her carefully constructed life wide open. She was going to save him. No matter what it cost. Grand rounds began at 7 in the morning, 30 residents packed into the conference room on the 3rd floor of St. Michael's, the kind of meeting where careers were made or quietly ended depending on who was speaking. Dr. Mercer controlled the room the way a conductor controls an orchestra, with authority that nobody questioned and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The projector hummed to life, and Sergeant Marcus Webb's chart materialized on the screen behind him, patient photograph, vital signs, discharge recommendations all laid bare for scrutiny. This case, Dr. Mercer began, adjusting his cufflinks, represents a fundamental challenge in modern hospital economics. His voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being listened to. Patient arrived 3 days ago in critical condition. Bilateral pneumonia, malnutrition, complications from untreated sepsis. 5 qualified physicians examined him, Dr. Harrington, Dr. Patel, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Kim, and myself. All 5 reached the same clinical conclusion. He paused, letting the weight settle. This patient was not viable for aggressive intervention. Sarah stood at the back of the room, her posture perfect, her expression carved from stone. She wore the invisibility of night shift nurses like armor, present but overlooked, the kind of person residents learned to see through. Her badge hung against her scrubs, the metal catching fluorescent light. Nobody noticed her until Dr. Mercer turned and pointed directly at her position against the wall. Nurse Chen here has taken a different approach. The residents turned, 30 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on a woman who'd been background moments before. She's decided this patient deserves aggressive care despite his inability to pay. Despite his complications. Despite the simple fact that resources are finite and must be allocated to viable cases. He moved across the front of the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. This is what happens when bleeding hearts override hospital economics. We're not a charity. We're a business. And businesses that don't manage their resources don't survive. The silence stretched for exactly 3 seconds. Then the residents nodded, understanding the hierarchy, understanding where authority sat in this room and where it didn't. Dr. Mercer smiled, satisfied. Sarah didn't blink. Didn't shift her weight. Didn't acknowledge the dismissal or the insult wrapped inside it. Her hands remained at her sides, steady as surgical steel. 2 hours later, during her break, Sarah found herself at the 4th floor vending machine, the one in the alcove that smelled like stale coffee and the ghost of 1,000 late-night conversations. She was reaching for bottled water when she heard the footsteps, deliberate, purposeful, accompanied by the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes that could only be security. Dr. Mercer rounded the corner with 2 guards flanking him, positioned 10 feet back like sentries waiting for orders. He was still wearing his white coat from grand rounds, still carrying that smile. Up close, that smile looked like something a predator might wear just before the kill. "I've been looking into your background, Chen." His voice dropped into the register of a man sharing a secret. "Your medical degree. I had our credentialing department verify it. You know what they told me." He stepped closer. Barely adequate. Third world institution, standards that wouldn't pass California's licensing board, yet somehow you managed to slip through Texas's system. He laughed, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. Your credentials are barely worth the paper they're printed on. Sarah waited. She'd learned patience in a place where impatience got people killed. In Baghdad, in the field, during the 12 days she'd spent pinned down in Fallujah with 2 wounded Marines and a radio that wasn't working, patience was oxygen. One more thing, Dr. Mercer continued, his voice dropping lower. I looked at your employment record. Lots of gaps. Lots of unexplained transitions. Makes me wonder what you're really hiding. He leaned against the vending machine, his shoulder inches from hers. But here's what I know for certain, I've terminated better nurses than you for far less. One more move toward that blind soldier, one more interference with my patient management decisions, and I'll have these gentlemen escort you from this building permanently. You'll never work another day in Texas. You understand me? The fluorescent lights above them buzzed with the sound of 1,000 dying insects. Sarah turned her head and looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her eyes made him step back. It was the look of someone who'd seen worse than he could imagine, who'd buried people he loved, who'd held life and death in her hands and understood the weight better than he ever would. When she spoke, her voice came out quiet. Controlled. Like ice settling on a frozen lake. The difference between us, Doctor, is that I've actually held a dying man and knew what to do. She turned and walked away, her pace unhurried, her shoulders straight, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like a countdown. Behind her, Dr. Mercer's face flushed red, the color climbing his neck and spreading across his cheeks like an infection. The security guards exchanged glances, the kind of look that passed between men who recognized they'd just witnessed something they didn't have the authority to interrupt. Nobody stopped her. Nobody moved at all. But that wasn't the worst part. Sarah made it through the rest of her shift, checking vitals, documenting notes, moving through the hospital with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to operate on muscle memory alone. Her hands remained steady even as something crystalline and dangerous formed in her chest, not anger, but something colder. Something with teeth. At 3:15 a.m., during her final rounds, she stopped by the nurse's station and found the reassignment notice already posted to the assignment board. The notice was printed on standard hospital letterhead, Dr. Mercer's signature at the bottom in ink the color of old blood. Below that, another line, asterisk access to ICU patient rooms flagged in system. Nursing interventions on previous assignment restricted to other staff. Asterisk. Sarah read it 3 times, committing every word to memory. She'd seen strategic moves in Baghdad, the way insurgent leadership worked, how they isolated targets, how they eliminated problems by removing access rather than creating obvious resistance. Dr. Mercer had just taught her something about himself, he was competent. He understood how systems worked. He wasn't a man who simply yelled louder, he was a man who held institutional power and knew exactly how to weaponize it. She looked at Sergeant Webb's chart one final time. His oxygen saturation was dropping incrementally, 88% now, down from 92 that morning. His left lung sounds were diminished. The pulmonary consult Dr. Mercer had ordered was inexplicably cancelled. The transfer order noted comfort care trajectory, which meant no aggressive intervention. Which meant let him decline. Sarah walked to Webb's room anyway, even though her access was flagged, even though she was reassigned as of 7 a.m. He was sleeping, his blind eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with effort that shouldn't have required that much work. She checked his oxygen tubing, his foresight, his monitor leads. Everything was correct. Everything was just barely adequate. Everything was designed to keep him stable as long as nothing went wrong. If something went wrong, he'd spiral. Fast. The kind of fast that happened between shift changes, in the gaps between monitoring, in the spaces where nobody was looking. Sarah stood in that doorway for 45 seconds, her mind running calculations. She'd been trained to predict cascading failures, medical, tactical, operational. She'd been trained to see 3 moves ahead. And what she saw was Sergeant Marcus Webb declining steadily over the next 48 hours, deteriorating in ways that appeared natural, that appeared like simple disease progression until nobody could prove otherwise. She needed access to his room. She needed to be present when the critical moments came. She needed to be the one holding the needle when his lung collapsed. The problem was that Dr. Mercer had just removed her ability to do any of that. Sarah clocked out at 7:04 a.m., her badge scanning through the employee exit as if she were any other night shift nurse heading home. She sat in her car for 17 minutes before starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel while the pre-dawn air moved through San Antonio like a held breath. The hospital rose behind her, steel and glass and institutional purpose, and somewhere inside that building, a blind soldier was sleeping on a descending trajectory. She pulled out her encrypted phone, the one the Pentagon had issued, the one that connected to numbers that technically didn't exist. She scrolled to the last message, the briefing that explained why Sergeant Webb mattered enough that the military had placed a former Special Forces captain in a hospital as a night shift nurse. Baghdad, 2019. Black Ops extraction gone wrong. Webb was there. Webb saw what happened. And now Webb was slowly dying in a hospital where the chief of surgery had decided he wasn't worth saving. Sarah started driving. She had 6 hours before the orthopedic floor assignment went active, 6 hours before she lost all legitimate access to the ICU. 6 hours to figure out how to save a man she wasn't supposed to help in a hospital where the system itself had become the enemy. The morning traffic of San Antonio moved around her like water around stone, and Sarah Chen, night shift nurse, former captain, woman nobody noticed, was already 3 moves ahead of everyone else. The parking lot was empty except for the rain. Sarah sat in her 2007 Civic with the engine off, the windshield fogging as her breath came in measured intervals. Her phone, a separate device she carried on the night shift, encrypted with military-grade protocols, buzzed against her thigh. The screen showed no sender. Just a timestamp, 23:14 hours. She opened it. 3 photographs loaded slowly, pixelating into focus. The first showed Marcus Webb in combat fatigues, Kandahar Province, 2019. The second showed him inside what looked like a bunker, coordinates visible on a wall map behind him. The third was a map marked with red XS and a single line of text, Eagle Nest Witness. Asset value, classified. Enemy priority, extraction or elimination. The message itself contained exactly 12 words, your placement authorized under JSOC protocol. Webb contains classified intelligence. Protect his location. 2-star General Patricia Holloway. Sarah recognized the signature encryption key from her last briefing 3 months ago in a basement office at the Pentagon. Holloway had placed her here. Not for nursing performance. Not for hospital politics. For a blind man who had witnessed something so classified that foreign intelligence agencies wanted him silenced or stolen. Sarah set the phone face down on the passenger seat and watched the rain hammer the windshield like machine gun fire. 5 doctors had refused Webb. She had believed they were cowards, or pragmatists, or simply men who had learned to calculate the cost of compassion. But they weren't the real problem. They were noise. The real problem was that Dr. Mercer, a man who ran phantom surgeries and fraudulent billing schemes through this hospital like he was running a cartel operation, had decided she was interesting enough to destroy. Every move she made around Webb's bed now had an audience. Every chart note would be scrutinized. Every badge swipe logged. In Baghdad, she had learned to move through hostile territory without being seen. In San Antonio, she was visible in the worst way possible. Not as a soldier. As a problem. Her shift started in 43 minutes. The reassignment order would go into the system at midnight. After that, her old badge code would fail. The electronic lock on the ICU wing would recognize her, try and log it as a violation. And Marcus Webb would be in a hospital bed, unseen, undefended, with vital signs that were already beginning to drift. Sarah had survived worse odds. But never with this much at stake. Never with a child waiting at home who didn't understand why his commanding officer had stopped calling. Never with a mission so classified that if it went sideways, the Pentagon would deny she had ever existed. She started the engine. The heater wheezed to life, warm air pushing back against the November cold. Her hands on the wheel were steady. Hands that had held dying soldiers in the desert. Hands that had practiced needle decompression so many times that the motion lived in her muscle memory like breathing. Those hands would not shake. That was not how this worked. The drive to St. Michael's took 14 minutes. The parking garage smelled like oil and stale concrete, the kind of smell that never quite left hospital infrastructure no matter how many times it was cleaned. Sarah parked in the same spot she always used, walked past the security cameras, which she had memorized the angles of weeks ago, and entered through the emergency department side entrance. Her badge still worked for external access. For now. The night shift was in full rhythm. Trauma beds occupied. Someone in Bay 3 was being intubated. Sarah moved past the chaos like she was part of the wall, grabbed a fresh set of scrubs from the linen room, and changed in the bathroom on the second floor. No one noticed. No one ever noticed the night shift nurse who moved like she was made of air. The ICU was dim. The monitors beeped in their steady, mechanical rhythm, a sound that never changed, never stopped, just continued on like some kind of hospital heartbeat. Webb's room was the fourth one on the left. Sarah used her badge code at the electronic lock 7-3-4-9-8-2. The lock clicked open. In her mind, she started counting. The system would update in 41 minutes. After that, any badge swipe from her account would trigger an alert. She slipped into his room and closed the door softly behind her. The sound was almost nothing, just the softest click of the latch. Webb lay in the darkness, his eyes, those eyes that had saved Danny's life, pointed at the ceiling. But something was wrong. His breathing was too fast. Shallow. The kind of breathing that meant the lungs weren't inflating properly. Webb. Her voice was quiet. Professional. No trace of alarm. Can't. He gasped. His hand moved across the blanket, searching for the call button. His fingers found nothing but air. Can't breathe. Something's wrong. Can't. Sarah was already moving. The monitor showed his respiratory rate at 32. That was wrong. Normal was 12 to 20. His oxygen saturation read 84% and dropping. 82. 80. His lips were starting to turn the color of a worn bruise. She pulled his gown open and looked at his chest. The trachea, or the windpipe, was shifted to the right. Not where it should be. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. Air was accumulating in the space between his lung and chest wall, pressing against his heart, crushing his ability to breathe. Every beat of his heart was working against a space that was pushing back. Sarah hit the code button on the wall. The alarm would bring a response. Eventually. The night shift response time to the fourth floor was usually 4 to 6 minutes. Webb had maybe 3 before the hypoxia started causing permanent brain damage. "I'm here," she said. Not as a nurse. Not as the woman he didn't recognize. Just as someone who had done this before. "I'm here, Webb." She moved to the crash cart without hurrying. The movement looked casual to anyone watching. Calm. She pulled the equipment she needed, a 14-gauge angiocath needle. Alcohol swab. A second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same in every body. She had learned it 17 times in Baghdad, in field conditions, with mortar rounds incoming and blood on everything. Webb's oxygen was at 78%. His eyes were wide. Panicked. "What's happening?" "I can't." "Needle decompression," she said. "You've got air in your chest cavity. I'm releasing it." She felt for the space between his ribs. Second and third rib, the intercostal space, the path that ran straight to the pleural cavity. Her fingers found it like a map she had memorized years ago. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in, a solid, professional motion, and the sound that followed was the sound of survival, a sharp hiss of air escaping, pressure releasing, the sound of a man getting his life back. The O2 monitor climbed. 79. 82. 85. 90. His breathing slowed. The panic in his face didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Recognition. Not of her face. Of the fact that he was going to live. Medic. His voice was raw. Confused. Better, Sarah said quietly. The room stayed silent for 3 seconds. Then footsteps thundered in the hallway. The on-call resident burst through the door, and behind him came the ICU nurse assigned to Webb's care now, no longer Sarah's responsibility. They filled the space with their presence, their questions, their protocols. Sarah stepped back. Her badge code would fail in 23 minutes. She had done what she came to do. Webb was stable. His O2 was climbing. His breathing was normalizing. The collapse had been caught in the window where it still could be reversed by something as simple as a needle and the muscle memory of a woman who had learned to save lives in the worst conditions on Earth. She slipped past the resident, past the nurses, back into the hallway. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. She was just the night shift nurse, the forgettable woman who moved through the hospital like she was made of the same material as the walls. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had just revealed herself. On camera, in a room with a monitor, with witnesses who would be charting what happened here tonight. By tomorrow morning, Dr. Mercer would know exactly what she had done. And he would understand, finally, why she had been so interested in an unmarked patient that 5 doctors had walked away from. But that wasn't the worst part either. The worst part was that somewhere in the Pentagon, an alert was being triggered. Someone was flagging her classified security clearance. Someone had noticed the encrypted phone call. And in San Antonio, on a Wednesday night at 11:43 p.m., the machinery was already in motion. The machinery that would either destroy her or reveal her. The machinery that would change everything in the next 72 hours. Sarah walked toward the stairwell, listening to the sounds of the hospital settling around her, the monitors, the ventilators, the soft beep of the pneumatic doors. She did not hurry. She did not look back. Behind her, Sergeant Marcus Webb was breathing normally, oxygen returning to his blood, life returning to his eyes. That was enough. For now, that would have to be enough. 2 in the morning. Sarah sits at the monitor station, watching the grid of vital signs like a prayer she doesn't quite believe in anymore. Sergeant Webb's numbers are stable. Breathing easy. O2 at 92%. She has done what she came here to do. She has kept him breathing. Then his oxygen saturation drops. 90. 88. 85. Sarah's head snaps toward his room. The monitor alarm hasn't sounded yet, the threshold is 80, and they're not there, but they're moving in the wrong direction. She stands. Muscle memory doesn't announce itself, it just happens. Her feet are already moving before her conscious mind catches up. She's walking, then she's inside his room, and the light from the hallway cuts across his face in a thin line. Webb's breathing has changed. The rhythm is shallow. Labored. Each exhale comes with the sound of air searching for somewhere to go and finding nothing. She pulls back his gown. The left side of his chest rises and falls. The right side doesn't. Tension pneumothorax. The word doesn't feel like a word anymore. It feels like Baghdad, like the weight of a rifle strap against her collarbone, like the smell of diesel and blood in a field hospital where the air conditioning had stopped working 3 days before they got there. Where she had watched a man's lung collapse because an IED had punctured his pleural cavity, and the trapped air kept building and building until the pressure crushed his heart against his spine. She reaches for the supplies before she understands what her hands are doing. Alcohol wipe. 14-gauge angiocath needle. The needle is smaller than a grain of rice, but it might as well be a spear the way it catches the fluorescent light. Her hands don't shake. Her hands never shake anymore. Sergeant Webb. Her voice is low, clinical. I need to decompress your chest. Can't breathe. His voice is a rasp. A drowning man asking for air. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She doesn't know if he understands. She doesn't wait for understanding. Her fingers find the ribs like she's reading Braille, counting down from his collarbone. 1. 2. She marks the spot with her thumbnail, a mark no one else will see. The skin feels like paper that's been left in the sun too long. The needle goes in perpendicular to the chest wall. For a moment, nothing. For a moment, she has made a terrible mistake and inserted a needle into a blind man's chest for no reason, and his lung is fine and she has just. The hiss. That's the sound of air escaping. Trapped air, pressurized air, air that has been crushing his lung against the wall of his chest. The hiss is everything. The hiss is permission. She tapers the catheter over the needle and leaves it in place. Removes the needle. The catheter is flexible now, like a whisper. Webb's body heaves once, twice, and then something in him loosens. The tension breaks like a rope snapping under load. His oxygen saturation climbs. 81. 85. 90. 94. Breathe, she tells him, though he's already doing it. His chest rises and falls now in symmetry, both sides participating in the simple physics of living. You're going to be fine. She says it like a fact. Like a promise. Like a captain talking to a soldier who's been hit and is trying to stay conscious and needs to know that the person giving orders has seen worse and survived it. The monitor alarm sounds anyway. A courtesy. A formality. An observation of something that has already been fixed. She keeps her hand on his shoulder, monitoring his breathing, watching the numbers climb to safety. 1 minute. 2 minutes. His oxygen is steady now. His heart rate is dropping from the tachycardia of panic. His blood pressure, which had been hovering around 60 systolic, is climbing back toward something that doesn't trigger alarms. She has held this moment together with her hands. The on-call resident arrives 2 minutes later, moving fast and then stopping. Dr. James Patterson is young, barely 30, with a kind of smooth forehead that comes from never having made a decision that would keep him awake at night. He stands in the doorway and stares at the catheter in Webb's chest like it's a relic from an alien civilization. What did you? Patterson doesn't finish the sentence. Can't finish it. His eyes move from the catheter to Sarah's face to Webb's rising and falling chest to the monitor showing oxygen saturation at 96%. You can't. That's not in your scope. You're not authorized to. He was in respiratory distress. Sarah's voice is steady as stone. Tension pneumothorax. Unilateral breath sounds absent. I performed emergency needle decompression. Patterson's hands move like he's trying to grasp something that's slipping away. You need to document this. There's a protocol. We have to report. Report what? That I saved his life. She doesn't say it harshly. She says it like she's asking a genuine question. Patterson's face goes pale. He pulls out his phone and steps into the hallway, his voice dropping to urgent whispers. Sarah doesn't listen. She's watching Webb's numbers. Watching his color return. Watching a man who was drowning in his own chest cavity come back from the edge of something deeper than death. She has her hand on his good shoulder, steady, present, and for 3 more minutes she allows herself to believe that competence is its own kind of armor. Dr. Mercer arrives at 6:45 in the morning. He's still in street clothes, slacks and a button-down from home, his hair not yet perfectly styled, his face the color of new concrete. He doesn't come to examine Webb. He comes to examine Sarah, and the look he gives her is something like recognition and something like rage. He stands at the foot of the bed for 30 seconds, not speaking, just looking at the catheter, at Sarah's position near the monitors, at Webb's stable vital signs, and then he turns and walks out without saying a word. She knows what that silence means. She knows exactly what that silence means. By 7 in the morning, there are 3 phone calls that matter. Dr. Mercer makes them from his office. The first is to hospital administration. Linda Morrison, the HR director, picks up on the second ring, and Sarah can almost hear the color draining from her face through the phone lines. The second call is to Gerald Hastings, a board member who owes Mercer for covering up a malpractice suit 5 years ago, and Hastings listens and agrees to whatever Mercer is asking without protest. The third call is to the state nursing board investigator, and Sarah doesn't know about this call yet, but she will. She will know everything eventually. By 8 in the morning, security escorts are scheduled. By 9, she's in an emergency meeting in a windowless room on the 3rd floor that smells like industrial coffee and fear. Linda Morrison sits across from her. Patricia Hughes, the chief nursing officer, sits beside her. Dr. Mercer stands at the head of the table like he's leading a grand round, and his voice is the voice of a man who has absolute certainty in his power to destroy. Unauthorized procedure, Mercer says. Scope of practice violation. A night shift nurse doesn't perform needle decompression. That's advanced life support. That's physician territory. And when I checked her credentials this morning, he slides a folder across the table. There are inconsistencies. Her previous employment at the hospital she listed? I called. No record of a Sarah Chen. Linda Morrison opens the folder. Her jaw tightens. The Pentagon number she listed as a reference, Mercer continues, is classified. Which means she's either military intelligence or she's committing federal fraud by impersonating someone with military credentials. Either way, she's dangerous. She's hiding something. And she's put this hospital at legal and security risk. Sarah doesn't speak. Doesn't defend. The silence in the room is so thick you could perform surgery in it. She has calculated the cost of opening her mouth and found the price too high. Effective immediately, Patricia Hughes says quietly, "You're suspended pending investigation. Your badge is deactivated. Security will escort you to your locker." Sarah nods. One movement. Acknowledgement without argument. She knows better than to argue. She has learned this lesson in places where argument meant bullets, where the people giving orders had the kind of certainty that comes from never being questioned. She stands. Morrison looks away. Hughes looks away. Mercer watches her with the expression of a man who has just removed a threat from the board and is already moving on to the next piece. The security guard walks her to her locker in the staff break room. She changes out of her scrubs in front of him, like she's a suspect in custody, which she supposes she is. The locker smells like the inside of other people's afternoons, old granola bars and forgotten shifts and the metallic tang of keys. She pulls on her street clothes. Jeans. A grey sweater. A leather jacket that's older than her career as a nurse. The guards walk her to the parking lot like they're escorting a prisoner. But not before she sees the alert. Not before the Pentagon's automated system recognizes that a classified security clearance has just been flagged in a civilian hospital database. Not before the alert travels through networks that don't have names, reaches computers in offices without windows, and sets 3 different federal agencies into motion with the kind of quiet urgency that only comes when something classified has just brushed against something that's supposed to stay hidden. Sarah doesn't know about the alert yet. She doesn't know that in the next 18 hours, everything she has built will come apart. She doesn't know that the Pentagon has noticed. She doesn't know that Dr. Mercer's amateur investigator has just accidentally turned on a light in a room that was supposed to stay dark. All she knows is that she's driving home at 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, still wearing the smell of antiseptic on her skin, still feeling the weight of a needle in her hands, and her son is at school and her job is gone, and the flag, the folded flag from Martinez that she has kept for 7 years, is sitting on her kitchen table waiting for her to explain why she's home during the day. By 2 in the afternoon, she's sitting at that table. The flag is pressed against her chest. It's small enough to fit in the palm of her hand but heavy enough that she feels it in her spine. She has held this flag the way other people hold photographs. Like evidence. Like testimony. Like the only thing that proves someone lived. She doesn't hear Danny come home from school. The door opens and closes and his backpack hits the tile, and then he's there, in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, and his eyes are wide and confused and afraid in a way that's too specific, too precise. A 10-year-old's fear of something wrong that he doesn't have the vocabulary to name. Mom. His voice is small. Why aren't you at work? Sarah looks at her son. She sees Danny's face, and she sees Sergeant Webb's face, and she sees Mercer's face, and she sees the memory of her own face in Baghdad, reflected in the visor of a helmet that's now dust. She has no answer that doesn't require her to lie or to tell him the truth, and the truth is something too large and too heavy for a boy his age to carry. She opens her mouth. The phone on the table buzzes. It's encrypted. Pentagon Protocol. A text message in code that translates to 3 words, alert activated. Stand by. Danny is still waiting for an answer. He's still afraid. And Sarah is still holding the folded flag like it's a prayer, like it's a promise, like it's the only thing left standing between her and the world that's about to break open. The background check Dr. Mercer demanded triggered an automatic Pentagon alert when Sarah's classified security clearance was flagged in the hospital system. He didn't know what he'd done. He had no idea that a simple credential verification would trip protocols designed to protect the highest levels of military intelligence. At 8:41 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, a computer in an underground facility in Arlington, Virginia registered the query. At 9:15 a.m., 3 black SUVs pulled into St. Michael's Circular Drive. Nobody knew they were coming. The rain that had been falling all morning stopped, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Sarah wasn't at the hospital. She was home. The kitchen table in her modest 1-bedroom apartment on Cypress Street held a single photograph, Danny at age 4, standing beside Sergeant Marcus Webb at a deployment ceremony in 2019, the two of them grinning like they didn't know what was about to change their lives. Next to the photograph lay a folded flag, pressed against her chest now as she sat motionless in a shaft of pale Texas sunlight. The flag was from the memorial service for Captain James Ghost Holloway, her team leader, the man who'd held a pressure dressing to his own abdomen in the Jolene district while she worked on the radio calling for extraction. Ghost hadn't made it. The flag had been folded by hands that had never forgotten his face. Sarah's hands, which had helped prepare his body for transport, now trembled, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of a woman who had carried a secret so long it had become her skeleton. Dr. Mercer had spent the morning making phone calls from his office on the 5th floor. At 7:19 a.m., he'd contacted Gerald Hastings, the board member who owed him a favor, specifically a malpractice suit from 2019 that Mercer had helped disappear by falsifying the surgical record. The Chen situation needs resolution, Mercer had said into his iPhone, his voice low and deliberate. Before it becomes a liability. Hastings had understood immediately. Favors called in, strings pulled. By 8 a.m., the investigation was moving. At 8:15 a.m., Dr. Mercer made the second call that would destroy him, though he didn't know it yet. He dialed the number listed under Sarah's previous hospital employment, the Pentagon cover number monitored by military intelligence analysts. He asked for credential verification on Captain, he caught himself, correcting, Nurse Sarah Chen. The woman on the other end of the line had said nothing for 3 seconds. 3 seconds was all it took. The number Dr. Mercer was calling wasn't registered to any hospital. It was registered to the Defense Intelligence Agency. By 9 a.m., Sarah's apartment door had received a quiet knock. Not loud. Not aggressive. Professional. She'd opened it to find a woman in a black suit holding a Pentagon credential folder the size of a small briefcase. Captain Chen. I'm Special Agent Lisa Ortega, DIA. The folder had closed with a sound like a judge's gavel. Your cover in the hospital is compromised. We're extracting you within 24 hours pending investigation into who accessed your classified file. Sarah had nodded once, a single motion that contained the weight of 4 years of hiding. For years of pretending to be invisible. For years of knowing that one mistake would expose not just her, but the intelligence operation she'd been placed inside to protect. The agent had waited for a response. Sarah had given her none. Instead, she'd walked to the kitchen table, picked up the folded flag, and held it like someone holding a lifeline. By 10 a.m., the background check Dr. Mercer had initiated had expanded beyond Sarah's credentials. The investigator from the State Nursing Board, a man named Robert Chen with absolutely no relation to Sarah and absolutely no awareness of what he was walking into, had begun pulling Mercer's own files. Routine procedure. Cross-check the accuser's history. Look for patterns of harassment or abuse of power. What Chen found made him sit back in his chair and reach for his supervisor. Phantom surgeries. Surgical procedures billed to Medicare under patient names that didn't match anesthesia records. Equipment costs inflated by 400%. 3 cases where Mercer had documented complications that didn't exist in the nursing notes. 5 cases where he'd recommended extended hospital stays with no clinical justification. The numbers were there, waiting to be found, like a confession written in billing codes. By 11 a.m., Sarah's phone had rung. Not the classified Pentagon line, the regular call. A voice she recognized, her son's school, Mrs. Chen. "Danny's been asking to come home early. He's not feeling well. Can you pick him up?" She'd said yes before the sentence was complete. She'd been driving to the school when the second call came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize. "Captain Chen, this is Colonel James Garrett, 160th SAW. I'm coordinating military extraction from St. Michael's. ETA, your location is 4 minutes." For minutes to understand that the worst-case scenario she'd trained for was now unfolding in real time. For minutes to remember that Danny was 10 years old and had no idea his mother was anything other than a nurse who worked nights. For minutes to know that everything was about to change. She'd picked Danny up from school at 12:41 p.m. He'd climbed into the backseat of her Honda Civic without asking questions, the way military children learn to do. Don't ask, just be ready. They'd driven home in silence, and she'd told him to do his homework in his room for an hour. Mommy needed to rest. He'd known that was a lie. Military children always know. But he'd gone upstairs anyway, and Sarah had sat at that kitchen table with that folded flag pressed against her chest like it was a promise she'd made to Ghost himself, a promise that she would protect the people Ghost had tried to protect, that she would hold the line even when the line was invisible. At 2 p.m., Danny had come downstairs. School had called his phone too. He'd gotten worried. He'd come into the kitchen and found his mother sitting in exactly the same position he'd left her, and he'd asked in a small, confused voice that broke something deep in Sarah's chest, "Mom, why aren't you at work?" She hadn't answered. She'd pulled him close instead, and for the first time in 4 years, she'd let herself cry. Not from fear. From relief. The secret was ending. The mask was coming off. But not in a way she'd planned, and not with the control she'd imagined. Control was an illusion anyway, she'd learned that in Baghdad. The only real thing was the people you were willing to fight for, and Danny was sitting against her chest, asking questions she couldn't answer yet. At 2:15 p.m., the classified alert had escalated. An automatic 30-minute window opened for military intervention in a civilian hospital if the operative's cover was actively compromised. At 2:45 p.m., the call came to Colonel Garrett. Dr. Mercer was at that very moment in the hospital cafeteria, still unaware that his phone call to the Pentagon cover number had triggered a federal investigation. He was eating a tuna salad and reviewing billing codes on his laptop, genuinely confused about why his background check on Sarah had been flagged as a data breach. He had no idea that the investigator from the State Nursing Board was, at that exact moment, walking into the office of the FBI's San Antonio field office with a folder containing evidence of Medicare fraud totaling $2.3 million across 12 years. He had no idea that his favor to Gerald Hastings, calling in a malpractice cover-up, had created a paper trail that would implicate board members, hospital administrators, and 3 pharmaceutical suppliers in a kickback scheme. He had no idea any of it. The SUVs pulled up to St. Michael's at 9:14 a.m. on Wednesday morning, exactly 18 hours after the initial alert was triggered. Not the DIA. The military this time. Colonel Garrett in dress blues, a 2-star general whose name wasn't given over unsecured channels, and 2 Marines in uniform carrying a folder marked Top Secret. They moved through the hospital with the kind of focused efficiency that makes civilian security guards step aside without asking questions. They went directly to the ICU. They went directly to Sergeant Marcus Webb's room. And what happened next didn't just silence the room, it ended careers. The Marine in dress blues read from a citation with a voice like a formal court record, crisp and precise: Captain Sarah Chen, Silver Star recipient for actions under fire in Baghdad, where she provided emergency medical intervention under sustained enemy fire and refused evacuation orders until all personnel were secured. Dr. Mercer, who had been called down to the ICU by the commotion, opened his mouth to protest about fraudulent credentials and hospital policy violations. The 2-star general stepped forward. He saluted. Not a casual acknowledgement. A full military salute, fist to chest, held for 3 seconds. On Sergeant Webb's bedside table lay 3 medals, each in its own presentation box. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. The general's eyes moved across them like he was reading a prayer. Captain Chen was placed here on my orders, the general said, his voice low enough that only 3 people heard it. Her assignment was classified. Her credentials are legitimate. And her actions in this hospital have been exemplary. The room went so quiet you could hear the heart monitor beeping its steady rhythm, the only sound that mattered. What happened next was the unraveling. The investigator from the State Nursing Board had finished his preliminary report and forwarded it to the FBI at 8:41 a.m. By 10:15 a.m., federal marshals had a warrant. By 10:13 a.m., Dr. Mercer was being walked out of St. Michael's past the nurses' station where Sarah once stood invisible, past the vending machine where he'd mocked her credentials, through the lobby where the staff he'd intimidated for 12 years watched him in handcuffs without a single expression. He didn't fight. He didn't protest. He walked past them all with the understanding finally landing in his chest that he'd made a single fatal mistake: he'd picked a fight with someone he didn't know. He'd picked a fight with someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose and absolutely everything to gain by standing her ground. The investigation that Dr. Mercer had initiated had turned like a weapon against him. The forensic accountant assigned to review his billing records found patterns going back to 2012. Phantom surgeries. Falsified anesthesia records. A relationship with a medical device supplier worth $47,000 in annual kickbacks. The surgical records he'd altered to cover for Gerald Hastings became evidence of a larger pattern. His computer contained emails discussing the elimination of unprofitable cases. Sergeant Webb's case was marked in a spreadsheet with a single notation: unviable, refer out. 5 doctors had refused Marcus Webb treatment based on a memo Mercer had circulated. 5 doctors following orders. 1 nurse asking why. The difference between them was now measured in federal charges. By Friday afternoon, Dr. Mercer had been charged with Medicare fraud, falsification of medical records, and conspiracy to obstruct federal investigation. The charges were serious enough to carry a prison sentence of 12 to 18 years. His attorney negotiated a plea deal, full cooperation with federal prosecutors, restitution of $2.3 million, voluntary surrender of his medical license. In exchange, certain charges would be reduced. Board member Gerald Hastings resigned and fled to his property in Costa Rica before the subpoena could be served. The hospital settled with the federal government for a sum they wouldn't disclose, and the 5 doctors who'd refused Sarah's patient, Dr. Harrington, Dr. Patel, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Kim, and Dr. Mercer, 3 of them were suspended pending review. Dr. Mercer got something different. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in San Antonio, Dr. Mercer walked into a classroom at San Antonio Community College, room 114, to teach CPR certification for $17.35 per hour. The name on the sign outside the door read simply R. Mercer. No title. No doctorate. Just a man who had wielded a scalpel with absolute certainty and lost everything by using it as a weapon instead of a tool. Through the classroom window, Sarah watched him demonstrate chest compressions on a plastic dummy. His hands moved through the motions: 30 compressions, 2 breaths, check for pulse. A student raised her hand. Is this gonna be on the test? Mercer nodded wearily. Everything is on the test. Sarah didn't stay long. She'd seen what she needed to see. A man who'd once made a physician's salary, who'd once commanded nurses and residents, who'd once believed that his authority came from his title instead of his character, was now simply demonstrating the basics of how to save a life to a room of students who didn't know his name and didn't care who he'd been. She turned from the window and walked toward the parking lot, toward the VA hospital where Sergeant Marcus Webb was being fitted for a prosthetic vision system, experimental technology that would allow him to perceive shapes and light through electrodes implanted at his visual cortex. Danny was with him, describing the view from the window. Sarah walked into the room and sat across from them both, and Webb turned toward her footsteps with new recognition, his vision system allowing him to see a human-shaped blur. "Captain," he said. Sarah smiled. "Just Sarah now, Sergeant." And they sat in comfortable silence, the three of them, in a room where everything had changed because one nurse had remembered that rank means nothing if you forget why you serve. Power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. That was the lesson she was teaching Danny. That was the truth she'd lived. And that was the truth that had brought down an empire of arrogance, one compassionate action at a time. If you've made it this far, you know what Sarah knew: standing up for what's right doesn't require a badge or a uniform. It just requires the courage to say yes when everyone else says no. Subscribe to see what happens when ordinary people become extraordinary heroes. What would you have done in Sarah's position? Leave a comment below.